In this clip, what we want to look at is the response then to the synoptic problem. If we don't know some of these things for certain, yet we know that there are many sources, that there are different writers, that they wrote at different times, what do we need to do? How do we need to respond to that in the way in which we see the Gospels, in the way in which we read the Gospels? Well, I believe that the first thing we need to do is to acknowledge, first of all, that the Gospels are not history. That they're not history. Now, we need to come to terms with that, at least in the sense of history as we understand it today, or at least as it's understood generally. Most people generally understand history as saying that what actually happened, what really happened. And often when we look at the parables, when we look at the miracles particularly, we say, what really happened? And there's a whole branch of theological exploration that tries to get away from the miracles. So for example, in the feeding of the 5,000, they say that in fact Jesus didn't take 5 loaves and 2 fish and distribute it among 5,000 people. What happened was that when Jesus started distributing, everybody else who had hidden away their lunch brought their lunch out, and they began to share their lunch with each other. And so instead of being a miracle, it really becomes a celebration of sharing. Now, that's a legitimate interpretation, but in fact it focuses on the wrong thing. Because what it's trying to focus on is on trying to deal with the truth or the historicity of the event. It's trying to saying, how can we make that event real even if we don't believe in miracles? On the other hand, of course, you've got theologians who say, oh, it was a miracle. And so they focus only on the miraculous aspect of the feeding of the 5,000. They focus on the fact that Jesus can take 5 loaves and distribute it to 5,000 people, or take 7 loaves and do it to 4,000 people. And so the focus there is all on Jesus, who is able to do miracles. I think both of those are legitimate, but maybe inadequate in terms of their interpretation. That the reason why the gospel writers are writing is not in order to provide us with history as we would understand it today. The truth of it is, though, is that there is no such thing as history, at least not that shows the truth, because every truth has to be seen through the eyes of the beholder, through the person who is writing that particular truth. And by virtue of that, the truth isn't the truth, but rather the truth as they perceive it, as they understand it. And so, in a sense, we need to come to terms with that with the writers, is that they're writing truth, but they're writing it from their perspective. They're writing it from their bottom line. They're writing it with their ulterior motive, with their motive that's under the surface. And unless we get to that motive that's under the surface, we're going to inadequately interpret the passages. So the first thing we need to see is that it most probably isn't history. The second thing we need to realize is that the writers of the Gospels were selective. They were selective in what they put into their Gospels. You look at Mark's Gospel, it's only 16 chapters. It's a small Gospel, it's action-packed, and because of that, we need to realize that he has chosen his writings. He has chosen his stories out of the myriad of stories that are available. In fact, Matthew tells us, John tells us, that if in fact we put all the stories and all the things that Jesus said, there wouldn't be enough books in the world to contain them. Now, that's a clue to us. And the clue is that they have chosen what to put into the Scriptures. They've chosen what to put into their stories. Now, if they've chosen what they're going to put in, then we need to realize that there's a reason for each story. The story is not there just to connect with each other. It's part of our understanding of God. It's part of wanting to achieve something for us. So they are selective. And so therefore, not only is the story selective, but you can also understand that they've worked with the story, that they've begun to mold the story, again, in order to fit their agenda, rather than in order to fit some 21st century understanding of truth. And it's that concept that we need to come to terms with the problem. Is that the problem of the Gospels there then needs to be understood in that selectivity. They're selective, they're careful in terms of which stories they're going to put in. The next thing we need to realize then is, why did they write them? I believe that they've written them for the concept of discipleship, not conversion. For discipleship, not conversion. And what that means is that what they're doing is they're doing it in order to teach. Their function is a teaching function rather than a trying to persuade. When you look at the Gospel of Luke, Luke says he's writing to Theophilus. Theophilus means a friend of God. He's not writing to people who are enemies of God. He's not writing to people who are outside of the framework of Christianity. He's writing to those who are already inside. And so therefore the reason for writing again is not to persuade you about Jesus. Is not to persuade you about the miracles or the potential power of Jesus. What he's understanding is that you already know that you already adhere to that. And what this is now trying to do is to grow you into a faith that you already have. By virtue of that, it then becomes the motivation for what is written is discipleship rather than persuasion or conversion. They're not trying to use the Bible to convert you. They're not trying to use the Gospels to convert you. They're trying to tell you what it means to now be a follower of Christ. The last thing that comes out of this, therefore, is that they should not be harmonized. Even though they are the Synoptic Gospels, i.e. that they have a similar chronology, a similar background, a similar flow of story, really only covering 1 year of Jesus' life. What we need to come to terms with is that the gospel writers do not want you to take all 3 gospels and squeeze them into one story. Unfortunately, that's what we do too often. Is that what we do is instead of looking at each gospel writer for themselves, what we do is we look them in comparison to the other 2. What we need to come to terms with is that most probably each of them were written from a different place to a different audience. And so therefore to bring them all together and to harmonize them is to do an injustice both to the writer and to the audience. So one of the things that we have to do in our exegesis, even though it is very difficult to do, is to get an inkling, is to get an insight into what were the original intent of the writers. And yes, that will always be an incomplete situation. It will always be one which we are still seeking to do. But of course, as we have archaeology, as we have other sciences like anthropology and sociology, so what we're beginning to do is to use the insights from those other sciences to understand the life and the environment and the time in which the gospel writers were written. And by doing so, what we do is we begin to get a better insight into the gospels themselves. So we don't harmonize them. Even though they may have similar sources, even though their sources may be interconnected, effectively what we still need to do is to see each gospel in and for itself. We need to look at each story and see how each gospel writer has formed that story in order to give us a better insight into who we're following and why we should follow him.